Imagine being the founding member of a band that would go on to sell millions and millions of records, set the tone and style of a generation, and become an all-time icon of rock and roll music, lasting for well over 50 years, but you never appear on an album cover. You're cast out as an official member of the band, relegated to duty as road manager. That's what happened in 1963 to blues pianist Ian Stewart, and that little band he was drummed out of, it was called the Rolling Stones. The crazy story of Ian Stewart, next on If Guitars Could Speak. Welcome, friends, to episode 22 of If Guitars Could Speak, the documentary series where we examine cool pieces of gear, awesome musicians, and interesting moments from rock history. Today I will tell you the story of the Lost Stone, a forgotten keymaster, if you will, the one and only Ian Stewart, and his ouster from the band he helped to form in the interest of progress, according to a flamboyant 19-year-old manager. We'll get to him later, though. Remember, if you like videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel for much more content like this, and please hit the like button below to let YouTube know that you think other music fans would like to see this video. And with that, let's get on with the video. There are a few red letter dates in rock history. John and Paul meeting at the Woolton Village Fete, Elvis Presley performing Hound Dog on Ed Sullivan, Buddy Holly dying in a plane crash, Dylan going electric, but just as important is the day that a young Keith Richards noticed an old childhood friend named Mick Jagger on train platform 2 of the Dartford rail station, carrying a number of blues vinyl records with him. The two struck up a conversation about music, and an enduring friendship and musical partnership was started that day. A short time later, they formed a band known as the Blues Boys. The Blues Boys performed mostly blues standards, and they read about Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated band who were playing at the Ealing Jazz Club. They cheekily sent a tape of some of their recordings, and Korner interestingly decided to actually listen to them. Even more interesting was that he was pleasantly surprised and impressed, and invited them over to the club. After meetings with Blues Incorporated members Brian Jones, Charlie Watts, and Scottish-born boogie-woogie pianist Ian Stewart, Jagger and Richards started jamming with the band. Eventually, Brian Jones would leave Blues Incorporated, taking Ian Stewart with him, and Mick and Keith, along with Jagger's childhood friend Dick Taylor, and they would all join a gang together. The addition of drummer Tony Chapman would complete this early lineup of the Stones. Richards tells the story that Brian was on the phone doing an interview with the Jazz News magazine when they asked him the name of the new group. Jones hurriedly scanned the floor and spotted a Muddy Waters record lying there, which had a tune on it called Rollin' Stone, and so Brian blurted out the Rollin' Stones. From that point, things would move quickly for the fledgling band. They would play their first show on 12 July 1962 at the Marquee Club in London. They would tour the UK playing Chicago blues with Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley songs sprinkled in. They would be picked up by Georgian manager Giorgio Gomelski, who owned the Crawdaddy Club and gave the Stones their first Sunday residency. Gomelski was a huge jazz and blues fan and felt that the Stones would usher in a, quote, international renaissance for the blues. Although Giorgio was certainly eager, he had too many other business interests to devote the time that the band needed to get off the ground. Enter one interesting young man named Andrew Loog Oldham. Only 19 years old at the time, Oldham had already had an interesting life. The son of an Air Force pilot from America who had been shot down in World War II and an Australian-born nurse, Oldham was a self-proclaimed hustler, working early as a publicist in his early to mid-teen years, eventually doing UK publicity for such acts as Bob Dylan on his first UK tour and for Brian Epstein and the Beatles. But in April 1963, a friend would recommend that Oldham go to see the Rolling Stones, and he would strike up a fast friendship, and the band agreed to turn over management to him and his business partner, Eric Easton. Oldham was so young, he hadn't reached the age of maturity in the UK yet, so he couldn't officially secure any deals without Easton's help and had to sign with the band with his mother's co-signature. Oldham was younger than any member of the Stones. Despite this, he had a savvy and wisdom well beyond his years. Oldham secured the Stones with a record deal from Decca Records, specifically targeting Dick Rowe, who had famously turned down the Beatles in 1962 by saying, quote, "Guitar groups are on their way out, Mr. Epstein." Not wanting to make the same mistake twice, Rowe and Decca signed the Stones and gave them extremely favorable terms for the era. They would earn 3 times a new act's typical royalty rate, get full artistic control of recordings, and ownership of the recording master tapes. Initially, Oldham tried to remake the Stones in the Beatles image, having the band wear suits and cleaning up their image, but very quickly, Oldham would have a different revelation about the band. While the Beatles image portrayed 4 cuddly and happy-go-lucky lovable mop tops, Oldham came to envision the Stones as the anti-Beatles. He wanted to make the Rolling Stones, quote, "a raunchy, gamey, unpredictable bunch of undesirables," and to establish that the Stones were threatening, uncouth, and animalistic. Oldham began to publicize this image to the press with headlines like, "Would you let your sister go with a Rolling Stone?" and also cheekily asking their fans to mug a blind beggar to find the money to buy the albums. Oldham enlisted the help of songwriter friends John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who would give the Stones "I Want to Be Your Man," which would become the Stones' first UK hit. He would also encourage Mick to take over the frontman role, pulling the spotlight off of current leader Brian Jones, and then further push Jagger and Richards to begin writing their own material. The sea change in the Stones' image to a more counterculture pop band divided the band, with Brian Jones becoming somewhat withdrawn and out of place. But this image change came with yet another hefty price to the early blues-centric version of the band. Founding member Ian Stewart would be effectively kicked out as a regular member of the band. Stewart's piano parts, as well as his role as booking agent and de facto manager, as he was the only member of the band who owned a telephone, had bolstered the early success of the Stones, but Oldham felt that Stewart's image of a square-jawed, burly Scotsman who was a few years older than the rest of the band didn't fit with his vision of the 5-man group of slender young men. Stewart was demoted to road manager and recordings only. Keith Richards would say about the affair, quote, "Stu might have realized that in the way that it was going to have been marketed, he would be out of sync, but that he could still be a vital part. I'd probably have said, well, F you, but he said, okay, I'll just drive you around. That takes a big heart. But Stu had one of the largest hearts around." Ironically, bassist Bill Wyman was even older than Stewart, but no one knew this until later in the 60s, as he'd kept his age a closely guarded secret. The amazing thing was that Stewart not only accepted this role, but he excelled at it. He loaded and unloaded the vans and drove the band miles to gigs. He learned how to change guitar strings. He set up Charlie Watts' drum set perfectly, every time, leading Charlie to say, quote, "I never once, ever swore at him," referring to his amazement at how well Stu had set them up. Stu would also go on to envision and help create one of the most iconic pieces of recording gear ever devised, the mighty mobile, the Rolling Stones Mobile Studio. You can get the full rundown on the RSM here with this previous episode of If Guitars Could Speak, but long story short, the Mobile Studio allowed the Stones to record anytime, anywhere, and would go on to be rented out to many other bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and record such seminal rock albums like Exile on Main Street, Led Zeppelin 4, and Machine Head. Despite Stu's role as road manager, he still contributed keys to every Stones album between 1964 and 1986, except for 3, and Mick would later say, quote, "He really helped this band swing on numbers like Honky Tonk Women and loads of others. Stu was the one guy we always tried to please. We wanted his approval when we were writing or rehearsing a song. We'd want him to like it." Stu favored blues and country rockers, and he would remain dedicated to his boogie-woogie style and early rhythm and blues. He refused to play in minor keys, saying, quote, "When I'm on stage with the Stones and a minor chord comes along, I lift my hands in protest." In 1976, referring to the Stones' tax exile status, Stewart said, quote, "You could squawk about money, but the money the Stones have made hasn't done them much good. It's really gotten them into some trouble. They can't even live in their own country now." Stewart would remain separate from the band in another way. He never joined in on the substance abuse problems that the rest of the band had. Quote, "I think he looked upon it as a load of silliness," said guitarist Mick Taylor. "I think it was because he saw what had happened to Brian. I could tell from the expression on his face when things started to get a bit crazy during the making of Exile on Main Street. I think he found it very hard. We all did. He would also frustrate the boys in the band by booking hotels that were somewhat far away from where the show was. The reason? Stu would seek out hotels with golf courses attached. Keith would later explain, quote, "We'd be playing in some town where there's all these chicks, and they want to get laid and we want to lay them. But Stu would have booked us into some hotel about 10 miles out of town. You'd wake up in the morning and there's the links. We're bored to death looking for some action, and Stu's playing Glen Eagles." Stu would also lend his boogie-woogie style to Led Zeppelin on Rock and Roll for LZ4 and the appropriate titled Boogie with Stu on Physical Graffiti. He would play on Howlin' Wolf's 1971 album, The London Howlin' Wolf Sessions, which also featured Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, Steve Winwood, and many others. Stewart would continue contributing on record as road manager and as manager of the Mobile Studio well into the 1980s, but Stewart started to have health problems in late 1985. On 12 December 1985, Stewart started to have respiratory problems, but he would die of a sudden heart attack while in the waiting room of a clinic he'd visited to get checked out. He was only 47 years old. The highest praise that anyone could give him probably comes from Keith Richards' autobiography Life in 2010. Of Stu, he said, quote, "Ian Stewart, I'm still working for him. To me, the Rolling Stones is his band. Without his knowledge and organization, we'd be nowhere." We can debate all day about Andrew Loog Oldham's decision to remove Ian Stewart from the early version of the band. Sure, it sounds like it was a pretty terrible thing to do to a founding member of a band, but we also can't really argue with the results that it eventually produced. And unlike some musicians who were kicked completely out of bands before they hit it big, like Pete Best and Dave Mustaine, at least Stu was able to continue contributing in a big way to the band's continued success. It's clear that within the family of the Stones, Stu left a big footprint and legacy behind, and his heart, wisdom, and ingenuity were integral to the Stones lasting as long as they have. So, raise a glass, or a putter, to Ian Stewart, the lost Rolling Stone. That's another episode of If Guitars Could Speak. As always, if you like what you saw, please drop a like on the video below, and consider subscribing to the Guitar Historian channel to see much more content like this. Thank you. We will see you next time.